So, have you ever needed something desperately in prayer, and you come to God, and it seems like He's absolutely silent? Maybe even like He's ignoring you? This is the story of a lady who didn't take no for an answer. Now, I will confess I am a little bit nervous about this title, because there are times where God's answer is no, and you have to receive that. You know, the person who's been praying, and their kid dies anyway, it's not because they didn't hang in there enough. I want that to be clear. But there are times when the Syro-Phoenician woman, she's the example for us, she's a model for us, that some of us don't recognize as something that's an okay way to deal with God. Because she even fights with God. She gives Him back talk. She talks back to Jesus, and Jesus is pleased with her. So I want to look at the story. Now, the story is both in Matthew and it's in Mark. And since I get to have a PowerPoint, I'm going to show you both, because there are a few details that are in Matthew, and there's a few details that are in Mark. They're not all exactly the same. So Jesus left that place where he'd been arguing with the Pharisees. Pastor Pierre preached on that last week. And he went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And if you're like me, you kind of want to see what that means on a map. So it's not important for those of you who aren't map people, but so Jesus has been near the Sea of Galilee here, and he goes up to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, Tyre and Sidon are about 20 miles apart from each other, so that's not a real specific address. But he's moving out into an area that's not particularly filled with Jewish people. This is the Gentiles area. And the Bible tells us, Jesus didn't want anybody to know he was there. But a Canaanite woman heard about it, and as soon as she heard about it, she comes running, because something in her, whether it was the Holy Spirit put it in her heart, or just she'd heard somebody tell her about Jesus, and something in her said, he's got my answer. And she's desperate, because her kid is being tormented by a demon. Now, we don't know what was going on. We don't know what that exactly looked like. But she knew her kid needed help. And those of us who are mothers or fathers know that when your kid is hurting, you get desperate pretty quickly. So she goes running, and she goes to Jesus and tells him the problem. Now, you'd think the answer she would get would be, great, let me fix the problem for you. But that's not at all what happens. In fact, the first thing that happens is that Jesus doesn't say anything. He's silent. He basically ignores her. And the next thing she does, because what do when God is silent? You go to the people around you who maybe know Jesus better than you do. Hey, pray for me. She goes to the disciples, and the disciples, great men of faith that they are, full of compassion and love, say, Jesus, send her away. She's coming after us and bugging us. She keeps crying out after us. And it's pretty clear that the reason probably that they're feeling that way is because she doesn't fit in. She's a Canaanite woman. She's a Greek from this area. Whatever it is, it's clear she is not Jewish. And so she doesn't fit in. Here she's a woman who's not Jewish. She's going to the Jewish healer. She may not know very much about who he is yet, but she believes that he's got the answer for her daughter. And so the disciples don't want anything to do with her. Jesus says, "No, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel." And it's a hard question. Why is Jesus being so obnoxious? Maybe to draw the faith out of her. That's the best answer I've heard. But we experience sometimes, certainly that God's people don't always give us a good answer, and sometimes we experience that God doesn't seem to be giving us a reasonable answer, or at least not the answer we need. The woman comes, she kneels before him, "Lord, help me." And Jesus gives this incredible insult. He says, "It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, that's not a nice thing to say. Calling her a dog, calling Gentiles dogs, is not, it doesn't mean puppy dogs. It doesn't. This is a big insult for that place and that time. She has, at one level, every right to say, "I am out of here." And honestly, I don't think that crosses her mind. But it wouldn't be surprising if she took offense and said, "How can I get help from somebody who's going to insult me?" But that's not her response. Instead, she hangs on to the one spark of hope that's there. "Jesus, you just said the dogs don't get the children's bread. But you know, I've got a puppy dog. And the dogs do get the children's bread when the children let it fall to the floor. They get the scraps." and she hangs on, and that's what she tells Jesus. "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And before I forget to mention it, one really heartening thing in this story is that Jesus makes it really clear that deliverance from oppression is the children's bread. And since we are children of God, if you're a believer and if you're not, you have the opportunity to be a child of God in that way. It's our bread. Not that we deserve it, but that God's reserved it for us. That's what Jesus died on the cross to pay for, is so that we would not be under oppression of the evil one. Anyhow, so Jesus praises her. Now, when I was a young Christian, I was told, you never question anybody in authority. And certainly you don't question God in any way, shape, or form. You know? If the pastor says jump, you don't say why, you say how high. But you know something? That's not the story we get in the Bible. There are times God told Moses, get out of the way. I'm going to destroy the people. I'll rise up a new nation through you. And Moses fell on his face. He wasn't disrespecting God. He was a little nervous about this process. But he said, please don't do it, God. He pushes back against God when he hears God saying he wants to do something that's actually kind of against God's nature. Here this woman's she believes, she knows in her heart, Jesus has the answer for her. He is able to deliver her daughter from the oppression she's under. And she won't take no for an answer. She pushes back against Jesus. She may not know that Jesus is God, but she knows he's God's man. You know, and so Jesus talked about prayer, and he talked about the woman who the praying is like the woman who goes to the unjust judge. And she keeps pushing against him, pushing against him, pushing against him, until he finally says, I give up. You know, maybe I'm not going to give in because I'm good. God is good. But the unjust judge gives in because she keeps pushing. There are times when God puts something in your heart, and it's right to keep standing, to come against Jesus, against the authorities, against God himself. I'm not saying every time, but there are times when that's your calling. And I want to tell the story of Gladys Aylward. So Gladys Aylward is a woman. She was born in 1902. When she was in her late 20s, she experienced a call to go to China. She knew that she knew that she knew that she was called to China. She got accepted by the Inland China Board, and she went to their missionary training school. But she had a problem. She wasn't particularly good with languages, and she flunked out. And the Inland China Mission said, you're not cut out to be a missionary. You're not going to be able to speak Chinese well enough. Sorry, this is not God's calling on your life. She knew it was God's calling on her life. She couldn't afford a ship passage to go to China. She took all her savings. She had something like £2 left. She worked as a housemaid in London. I believe it was in London, in England at any rate. And I think she had a little over £2 left. She bought a train passage on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to China. Only one problem. She gets there to the border, and there's a war between Russia and China. You know, so some people might tend to say, well, God's making it really plain, this is not going to happen. She gets arrested by the Russians. Somebody somehow rescues her. She gets across to Japan, and she manages to go from Japan to China. It's a powerful story. She teams up with a much older woman who is looking for somebody to share the work with her. They found an inn, and they're preaching to telling stories about Jesus to all the mule drivers and people who are then going to go out and tell the stories across China. She starts an orphanage. When the Japanese come in, she walks 100 kids to a place where they'll be safe. She did prison reform. She did all kinds of things. It's well worth reading her story. There's a movie. It's a fun movie called The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. It's a Disney-fied version. Okay? She was not real pleased with the movie because it makes there be more romance because movie makers like romance. It takes away some of the really hard things she went through. And it doesn't tell the story of God's miraculous hand in her life real super well. One of the things she said was, if God has called you to China or any other place, and you are sure in your own heart, let nothing deter you. Remember, it's God who's called you, and it's the same as when he called Moses or Samuel. Now, I think sometimes she felt out of place, because she said at one point, and I'm not going to try and quote this verbatim, but she said, I think God called somebody else first. I don't think I was his first choice. I think he probably called a man, and I think he probably called a man who was really well educated. Because she knew it took her a long time to learn Chinese. It was not an easy struggle for her. But she said, for whatever reason that man didn't go, God's first choice didn't take up the call, and she was willing. She had a willing heart, so God used her. Now, most of us do not have as gigantic a call as that on our lives. But, like the Syro-Phoenician woman, I think most of us, at some time or another in our lives, are called into a situation where we feel like we don't belong. We're not smart enough, we're not thin enough, we're not good enough, we're not old enough, we're not young enough, you name it. We don't fit in one way or the other. I think that's one of the things God delights in, frankly. He uses us in places where we don't fit in. And sometimes, like the Syro-Phoenician woman, we're a person, it's not just that we think we don't fit in. Everybody else thinks we don't fit in. They're not too thrilled. Now, I've been blessed in my life. In lots and lots of ways there have been open doors for me. But I do some things that make some other folks nervous. Among other things, I was in a church where, hey, how well you can do house cleaning and how neat and well-behaved your kids are is the measure of how spiritual a woman is. Unfortunately, I have ADHD. Took a while to find that out. But my two boys have ADHD, and they have learning problems. And they just didn't always fit the mold. And then God calls me to wave flags. Now, I don't know why God didn't do this, but God says, do not forbid to speak in tongues. He does not say, do not forbid to wave flags. And so I've got this calling, and not every pastor is too thrilled that I exercise that calling. But I want to share, years and years ago, a wonderful man of God who's a friend came up to me, and he said, Becky, because you're not a rose, and you're not a daisy. You think you're not a flower. He said, you should pray. Ask God what kind of flower you are. So, I'm obedient, right? I say, oh God, what kind of flower am I? Am I a violet? Am I an orchid? Am I a pansy? Honestly, nothing spoke to me. I did do what he suggested and pray about it, and it comforted me. That was a word that was a great encouragement to me. But then years later, I was thinking about that again. And thinking about God's calling in my life, which is sometimes looks a little bizarre to other people. And so, what I wound up writing, I may not be a rose or a daisy, or like any other flower I have known. I am still a flower in God's garden, an offering to be laid before the throne. I will bloom where I'm planted. I will bloom in God's time. My petals are unfolding, displaying God's reason and rhyme. The pathway that is laid straight before me may not be the pathway for you, but my shepherd knows just where he wants me. He knows what it will take to bring me through. I will bloom where I'm planted. I will bloom in God's time. My petals are unfolding, displaying God's reason and rhyme. And what I want to say is that for all of you, for each one of you, God has gifts. He knows He put them in your life. Other people may not know they're in your life, but God knows that they're there. And He has a place for those gifts to be used. The time is going to come. And hang in there. Be like the Syro-Phoenician woman. And say, God, I'm here. I'm here in this place that you brought me to. I may not fit. But because you brought me here, I do fit in. Yeah. I may feel like I'm a round peg in a square hole, but there is a place for me.